It's my pleasure to introduce my colleague Carrie from the Snohomish Conservation District. Carrie is the Program Director of Agroforestry and the Executive Director of Agroforestry Northwest. In her role, she helps lead the advancement of agroforestry throughout the Pacific Northwest. She's passionate about agroforestry as a solution to competing land use, climate adaptation and mitigation, and farmland resilience. Carrie's focus includes working with agroecological systems, and agroforestry focuses to include multifunctional, riparian forest buffers, food forests, and algae.
Well, thank you everyone for joining today. Today we are going to talk about wet peat farming. Go ahead and next slide, please. So just to give a brief overview, I am going to set some climate change context because that is why we are doing wet peat farming. I'm going to talk about some specific farmer challenges to our changing climate. I'm going to talk about agroforestry for adaptation, and then we are going to get into the specifics of what wet peat farming is and how that is helping farmers adapt to specific challenges in our region. And hopefully then we'll have time for some questions. So next slide. So I know we've probably all heard this ad nauseum, but just to get us all on the same page, these bullets come from the climate impacts group at UW. And just sort of set the context of where our climate is headed here in the Pacific Northwest. This is not to say that every year forward it's going to look exactly like this, right? But these are the general trends of where our climate is headed. And we are headed towards these warmer, drier summers, typically. We are headed towards more water in the winter months. So we are typically going to get the same amount of precipitation that we're used to getting in the Pacific Northwest moving forward. That precipitation is just going to be concentrated now into shorter periods throughout the year. So typically like maybe from November through April or May. And we're not going to get those nice rain events throughout the summer and fall like we're used to getting. Warmer winters also equal reduced snowpack. A lot of that precipitation is going to start to come to us in more rain events, atmospheric rivers, things like that. Less snow, less freezing, less snow. This can increase flood risks and can increase erosion and landslide risks. And then these drier summers that were, and falls that we're headed towards, sort of can point to overall water shortages, reduced water for irrigation on farmlands, and reduced quality of drinking water and water for recreation as well. I know that we've already had warnings on the west side about certain water bodies with too high fecal coliform counts or algal blooms. So more of that kind of thing in waters that you recreate. Increased wildfire risk with these hotter, longer, drier spells, larger wildfires, butter fires. We're all getting used to those sort of fire seasons now through, I know that the east side has been used to fire, but sort of these long smoky spells now that we didn't used to have. We are going to see increases in insect and disease outbreaks, and this is both in forests, but also on farmlands with crops and with livestock, and then changes in tree composition in our forests, and potentially changes in the types of crops that are going to be viable on our farms as well. Next slide, please. So we've got these trends to consider, and then we've got real challenges that landowners are already starting to face. So those things I expressed are things that landowners are already dealing with, right? And they certainly are noticing them more and more, especially in the last 5 years. And about 7 years ago, Snohomish Conservation District did what we called an ag resilience plan. And we went around to a bunch of farmers in Snohomish County. And we asked them what changes they were experiencing on their farms and what challenges they were experiencing because of those changes. And we started to hear a lot of common stories. And so this graphic is trying to get at representing what we heard farmers telling us. And certainly I'm a natural resource professional. I'm out there with farmers. My colleagues are out there with farmers, talking to them every day. And we continue to hear these sort of same challenges come up. And I'll explain this. So a lot of our farmers in Western Washington are lowland farmers. They are dealing with changes in the climate, but also social changes, development pressures, regulatory changes. Upland development is becoming more and more common on the hills up above our farms. Clear cutting, whether that's for timber harvest or whether that's for development, is occurring more rapidly. And we're getting these rain events, these atmospheric rivers, all these crazy things happening in the winter and the early spring. And all this water is converging down on their farmland. So a lot of additional water input that our lowland farms are taking on. And at the same time, a lot of our lowland farms have failing drainage infrastructure. It's old, it's failing somewhere else in the system. So taking on a lot more water, and it's becoming harder and harder to drain that off. They can try and repair drainage infrastructure. They can try and insert new drainage infrastructure, but that is becoming more and more costly and time consuming, and it's just becoming harder and harder with different regulatory pressures. So a lot of our farmers are expressing that they have areas of their farm wherein they have reduced access or lowered production. So we hear a lot of things like, hey, I used to turn my cows out in April on that field and I can't get them out there until July. Or, hey, I used to get 3 cuttings off that field over there and now I can only get 1. Or, hey, I can't get out to get my crops in the ground in time for me to get my harvest in fall. So we're hearing this more and more. So, next slide, please. We have approached many of these farms through grant money with WSDA to create agroforestry systems that can help these farmers adapt to these challenges and conditions that they're facing. Next slide, please. So what is agroforestry? I assume, have you all heard of agroforestry before? Would you say you're relatively familiar with agroforestry? Cool. I'm seeing some nodding. That's cool. There are a lot of definitions of agroforestry. I like this one because it's fairly descriptive. So essentially what agroforestry is we are taking land use systems that we've spent over 100 years now sort of chopping up and putting into different landscapes, and we're kind of recombining them on landscapes, really reinserting trees and perennial crops back into open farmland, or going into already treed lands, into forest ecosystems, and intentionally cultivating non-timber forest products within those ecosystems. So those are the 2 basic approaches to agroforestry. And within any agroforestry system, there are 3 main goals, whether that's on open farmland or in a forest ecosystem. We have these 3 main goals. One is to, and those are the highlighted ones, that to increase yield, right? We want our working lands to be producing products for human use, food, materials, medicines. But at the same time, agroforestry has the goal to realize ecological benefits and to maximize for ecosystem services, no matter what kind of landscape we're on. So we design and manage these systems for all three of these goals. Next slide, please. I have to acknowledge that this is nothing new. Native peoples here in this state, in this region, have practiced agroforestry for thousands and thousands of years. And agroforestry certainly is built on traditional ecological knowledge. Next slide, please. So why agroforestry for the changing climate? Why agroforestry for creating adaptation on farms? Agroforestry is being looked at more and more by governments at all levels, federal, state, local. It's being looked at by NGOs, by all types of organizations around the globe as a main solution to climate change. One of our main land-based solutions to climate change. And this is actually a chart from 2012, so this is a little bit outdated. There's more relevant and updated research. I'll have to update this slide. But you get the gist. Essentially, what they're doing here is comparing different types of land use and the potential of that land use to sequester and store carbon. And we see, grazing management is a good one. And wetland restoration, there's all types there. But then we see the potentials of agroforestry. And really a rock star when it comes to sequestering and storing carbon long-term in land-based systems. So it's being looked at and funded more and more as a way for governments to meet climate targets and help farmers adapt and do all those things. Next slide, please. And I want to show a local example of this. So this chart was put together by Dr. Lynn Carpenter-Boggs from WSU. She's a soil scientist. And she was looking at the state of Washington. And she was looking at different carbon farming practices. And you can see them listed down there at the bottom. What rotation means is rotational grazing. And then she has listed on the right side, she's got different counties in Washington state listed out. Why did she do that? Because those different counties represent different climates and they represent different soil types. And the type of climate and the type of soil that you have is going to impact the amount of carbon that you can sequester and store in nature-based application. And so you can see the potential for different types of farming practices in different counties in Washington state. And then she modeled the addition of trees into a lot of these farming systems. And so this is a great local example of the potential of agroforestry just within Washington state to be a major climate change solution, a mitigation tool. Next slide, please. This is a cool chart put out by NRCS about adaptation. So I kind of talked about agroforestry and its potential for mitigation. Now I'm into adaptation here. So what NRCS has done, as you can see, is on the left side here, they listed different risks that working lands might be facing and dealing with. In the middle, they've listed the adaptation that these working lands would need to help mitigate for that risk. And then on the far side, on the right side there, they have listed an associated agroforestry practice that you could implement with a landowner to help them mitigate for the risk you see. So this is great, like I said, put out by NRCS. It goes down farther, I've cut it off. But it's a great little chart if you're thinking about agroforestry practices with landowners that are expressing any of these concerns. Next one. So we have landowners, we have a changing climate, we have landowners actively expressing concerns. We have common challenges here. And so what we did is we got funding through WSDA through a specialty crop block grant to design an agroforestry practice that allowed these specific conditions and allowed us to help farmers to adapt to these specific conditions and these specific concerns that they were facing. And so that's what you can see down in the corner there, these high value perennial crops. So we're bringing high value perennial crops into these spaces, into that field where they can't get their cows anymore, into that field where they have reduced hay cuts, right? Into that field where they can't get out there to plant the crops. We're going in with these high value perennial crops to bring production back to these spaces and to reduce the amount of action, the amount of tractors that they have to use to get out. Next slide, please. And also allowing them to not have to go in and spend a lot of time and money putting in more drainage infrastructure. Because at the same time, while they're frustrated that they have all this water in the spring that they can't get rid of, they're also considering, hey, I'm about to go into a long, hot, dry summer. Do I necessarily want to drain off all this water as fast as I can and then have to irrigate a lot more for summer months? So agroforestry adaptation, yeah, I already kind of talked about this. This is redundant. Next slide. So for this grant, we focused on 3 specific crops. So the way we designed this was we had these 3 main crops that the farmers could choose from. So they could choose all 3 of these crops within their system, or they could choose 1 or 2 of the 3. But whatever it was, they had to have at least 1 of these crops within their agroforestry system. And we had to focus in on some crops so we could do some market analysis and some research around buyers and that kind of thing. So we chose these 3 specifically because they represent crops that are pretty well adapted to the conditions I described. So aronia berry is a rock star in these kinds of conditions. It's incredibly hardy, incredibly productive. Has an emerging market. So it's being known as a superfruit. It is being touted in health markets and specialty markets. I have one farmer that has a gentleman that flies over from Florida and picks all of his aronia berry and flies home. It's got the same nutritional profile as elderberry, which is, people take elderberry syrup for their cold and flu in the winter. So very similar to elderberry, but actually being shown to be even more beneficial than even elderberry. So a strong emerging market. So that's one of the reasons we chose it. And then there's this ability to grow and thrive in these sort of wet, mucky conditions, but then also be able to dry out of it in the summer months. Cider apples do not grow in the conditions I described. So what we did is we took the Pacific crabapple, Malus fusta, which does thrive in these conditions, and we grafted commercial cider apples, dessert apples onto that native rootstock to allow for those commercial varieties to thrive in these conditions. So that's what we did with that. And then basketry willow has a niche market, but if it's one you can access, it can be quite a good market. And a lot of farmers have farm stands or CSAs or things like that, where they've got cut flowers and ornamental cuttings and things, and they can add this to that stream of income that they already have. So those were the 3 that we chose, and that's why we chose them. And then what we did was we allowed our farmers to diversify from there. And we kind of said, you can pick, as long as, we're picking things that can stand these conditions, you can pick other crops, other things that will diversify your stream of income and diversify the system. And so these represent just a few of the other things that farmers chose to put into their systems. Next slide. So I'm going to talk about the farms that participated in this grant and talk about the systems that they planted, some of the challenges, the types of crops they inserted, and kind of where things are going with their plantings. Rooted Northwest, this was the farm. Oh, and I didn't mention this. This was also a collaboration between Snohomish CD, Woodby Island Conservation District, and Skagit Conservation District. So we had farms in each one of these counties. And so Rooted Northwest was our farm in Snohomish County, 250-acre diversified farm, a little dairy farm that mostly did hay and corn silage. And so what was the problem on this farm? Well, it was kind of just what I described earlier. They had failing drainage infrastructure. That infrastructure was put in over 50 years ago and it has failed. They have reduced hay production and they just can't get equipment out to this area of their farm. Next slide. So they did a 3-acre planting in this sort of problem area that you see. They did an alley cropping system, which is one of the agroforestry practices. And they planted in this, the alleys are at 30-foot spacing so that they could continue to get hay equipment in there. Because right now, these tiny little perennials that you can barely see are not producing anything. And so they can still get hay equipment in there, they can still get cuttings of hay while these perennials grow and while, you know, up until they produce. I mean, their hay production is reduced, but they can still get in there and get the 1 or 2 cuttings on a good year and have some income still from the space while those perennials are getting up and going. And then within the rows themselves, the species were put in at 6-foot spacing. So it was pretty dense planting. And the main crop that they chose out of our 3 main crops was the Aronia. They also put in, they did also plant, you see that little square up there on the far picture, that tiny square kind of up to the corner. They did plant in basketry willow, but they wanted to manage it very specifically in this very specific cutting block. And so they inserted that kind of off the corner by itself in a very, very wet pocket. So they diversified the rows, their alley cropping system with pawpaw, American bush hazel, the things that you see here. Pawpaw, I don't know, are any of you familiar with pawpaw? All right, some of you. Pawpaw, not typically something you would put in a system like this. But the thinking here was that apparently pawpaw, and the landowner did this research, so it's experimental. Apparently pawpaw can tolerate these conditions when it's dormant. And as long as the system drains out, the water table goes down before that tree breaks dormancy, it's able to do okay in these conditions. Pawpaw in our region, I don't know Western Washington, I don't know if any of you played around with it in Eastern Washington at all, but in Western Washington, pawpaw tends to break dormancy pretty late because it wants it to be warmer, it wants it to be sunnier, it wants that soil to be warmed up. So the thinking was, okay, pawpaw's pretty late to break dormancy, maybe things will be drained out. Very experimental, I don't know. We will see about the pawpaw. We also got seedlings that were like this big. So, what are the challenges with this planting? It wasn't plant survival. So we put the plants in, plant survival's been great. We've had I think 3% die off. Mainly the challenges here have been deer runs. And so just this last spring, we went and we installed, and I should have put a picture in here, a 3D deer fence around this 3-acre parcel. That willow is already got a deer fence around it, but around this 3 acres, we did install a 3D deer fence. Are any of you familiar with that 3D deer fencing system? So a 3D deer fence, instead of that big, 8-foot tall black stuff everywhere, it's step-in posts with 3 wires, and you have a first row with 2 wires about, I think the first one's at about 4 or 5 feet, and the second one's 3 feet, so 3 to 5 feet. And then you have 3 feet, and you have another row of wire at about 3.5 to 4 feet. And so it creates this weird visual effect as you approach it. And apparently is a weird visual deterrent to deer. It's being used in the Midwest a lot. There are some people out on the islands using this and finding good success. So we did install this, and at the moment, the plants are thriving. The deer pressure has gone way down. We did electrify some of those strands as well, just for extra measure. But the 3D deer fencing is really helping with that, those deer pressure. Yeah.
And these, is it just hot wire or hot tape?
Hot wire.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wondering if that's a little bit slower.
Next slide, please.
I had a quick question. What kind of perennial herbs were they planning on eventually putting in the hay sections?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So allied cropping systems do represent sort of these transition type systems, right? So you're getting your annual crop or your hay cutting or whatever it is while perennials are small, but as those perennials get big and as they start to shade out those alleys, you're transitioning to something else. And so this farm actually is planning to transition to perennial herb production, I believe. So there are a lot of herbs that actually thrive quite well in shade. And so they will eventually transition to that. That's our next farm is Northwest Meadowscapes. This is a farm on Whidbey Island. This is a 15-acre orchard and native seed farm. Maybe some of you have bought native seed from this business before. The problem here, failing drainage infrastructure again. This was an old converted wetland. So this gentleman bought this farm. This was, 100 years old farm. It was originally a wetland. They went in like over 100 years ago. They drained it off, which is how a lot of our farmland was created. And they grew hay and they raised beef cattle on this farm. And then the family got out of farming. That farmland sort of stayed fallow for many years. And then this gentleman bought this piece of property. And when he bought it, he quickly realized he bought it with dreams of having an apple orchard. So his passion is old world French style cider, hard ciders. And he even went to college and has a degree in cider, French, apple, stuff like that. So he bought this farm and he's going to grow these amazing cider apples and he's going to have this amazing orchard. And he got there and realized that drainage infrastructure was done over 100 years ago. It was not functioning. And this land was converting back into that kind of wetland scenario that it had originally been. And so he wasn't going to grow up the center, right? What was existing on this land were these kind of dense hedgerows. And so I will say, this gentleman is also a biologist for xerces. So we've got a lot of this great biology, and he specializes in meadow restoration. So got a great sort of knowledge to work with. So he kind of took a year to observe what was going on this farm and discovered that there was an apple thriving, and it was the Pacific crab apple. And so he was like, well, let me take my amazing cider apples and graft to the Pacific crab apple. And he actually informed a lot of the work we did with our other farmers. He did a great SARE study about that you could look up, Eric Mader, Northwest Meadowscapes. You can look it up on this, the SARE database. Because his research is all in there, but did a great SARE study with what varieties of apples graft well to Malus fusca. So we did a lot of that work, and then again, you can see planted out his rows of these apple trees in an alley cropping type of situation again. This is space wide enough for him to get, so he's got this little seed harvester, and it is space wide enough for him to get his seed harvester through these alleys. And what he grows in these alleys are these native meadow species for restoration, and then for his seed business. This is surprisingly very lucrative. One of the few farms I know that like makes good money. So who knew? How he got into the native seed was his knowledge, and he initially had laid down sort of the black solarization stuff to kill out the sod. And pulled that up, went to, was gonna plant his apples out, and just started seeing things
Seed
popping up, right? This old seed bank that had been there that now had opportunity to start thriving, and he's like, oh my God. And so this farm is really interesting. It really represents this sort of cool mashup of agriculture and production with restoration, because he's got a lot of like endangered bird species and butterflies and things now that are thriving on his property just because of the way he's producing. But anyway, I'm getting off on a tangent. Failing drainage infrastructure, converted wetland, really hard conditions to grow in. Next slide. And I kind of already described his system to you as well. But what we did here is he is also, so that image on the bottom, and you see the road, on the other side of the road is a house, and then the Puget Sound, right? He's got surface waters coming off his land and draining right into the Puget Sound. And fish and wildlife, I've been out on this farm a lot, and half the time I'm out there, fish and wildlife is out there, documenting fish species and all kinds of stuff. So he's got his alley cropping system in that image up at the far corner there. His alley cropping system kind of up in the corner there. And then this water, just tons of water comes down, really hard conditions for him to cultivate and play. You can see this strip that we're working here. And then this water empties out into this surface water, goes down the road and dumps out into the Puget Sound. So we came in here and we planted this wet sort of swale out in a lot of the crops that you see. His main crops that he chose, the cider apples, the aronia, and then we just filled in all kinds of native stuff for his native seasons. Oh yeah, the alley cropping. So those alleyways are at 10-foot spacing. Again, transitioning into perennial herbs or shade tolerant native seed production is his plan in that alley cropping space. The challenges here, again, plant survivability is great. The main challenge was intense deer grabs. And so the last year we had to come in and just give this gentleman a big old deer fence so that his plants could get above those little tubes. They just weren't getting above them. So we've got a nice big deer fence now and things are looking good. Next slide. This is Bell's Farm on Whidbey Island. This is a multi-generational farm. They've been an institution on Whidbey for over 100 years. It's a 65-acre farm. They do a combination of like strawberries and some veggies, and then this multi-species grazing. This is Kyle. He is taking over the farm from his, I think it's his wife's family. So he and his wife are taking the farm over. And they are transitioning this farm into a lot of agroforestry practices. And so he has this spot next to this retention pond that he has for irrigation that is got these conditions that I'm describing, saturated late to the spring. You just can't get cows out there. You can't do anything with it. The soil will just dry out in the summer. Luckily, he's got that irrigation pond right next to it. So those are the conditions. Next slide. Here's the planting that we did on his space. So we just did a small 1 acre planting in here because he wants to try agroforestry out. And this is typically in Western Washington, how we see agroforestry adopted. We typically see it adopted about at an acre or 2 acre to 3, an acre to 3 acre scale. Farmers mess around with it for a couple of years, they get used to it, and then you start to see it creep across their more and more. So typical first kind of round agroforestry planting here, 1 acre, done in an alley situation, not to grow a crop, but to have forage that he will run his livestock through, sort of in a flash grazing kind of a way. So livestock will be turned in here just to hang out, will kind of be flash grazed through the space. Again, the dominant crops in this system were the basketry willows and the cider apples. He's got a great farm stand where people come and get cuttings or flowers and things. So the basketry willows fitting great to this system. And then the cider apples, I think they're starting, they do value added, they make jams, like that. So they added the cider apples. And then he diversified with natives. California oatgrass as a forage. It was cool because we connected this farmer with the previous farmer I just talked about, and he is doing a lot in native forages, reintroducing a lot of the native grasses as forages for his species or for his livestock, and trying to sort of weed out the non-native forages that exist. The challenges at this site, no deer pressure, but this sort of hot, dry summer. So the first year we did the planting, we planted rather late because of family situations, issues that were going on. So we planted rather late, and then it got really dry and hot really fast. And of course, at the same time, his irrigation pump broke down. And we did not get it repaired. And most of the plants perished just right off the bat. So we went in with the second year and we did another round of planting. Luckily, we have the budget to do this. Replanted this system out. He got his pump fixed. We planted earlier this season, luckily, and things are looking really good. The main issue now that he has is this bowl pressure. So we've got some tubing and some things that are helping with that. So we're planting, yay. Next slide, please. Before I talk about this, I do want to just with the Malus fusca and the grafting. So the way we have been doing that, when do we graft? We have been planting out the Malus fusca, letting it do its thing, and then we come back the next year and we graft onto it in field. Which may be a little strange to folks who are really into grafting and things like that. I know we asked some gentlemen around the area that were real professional grafters to come out and do some training with us. And they were just like, what, you're grafting in the field, this is us. Yeah. Anyway, so that's what we've been doing. And it's been interesting. It's been fairly successful. So yeah, that's just the grafting technique we've been using with the Malus fusca. Although I will say, with a second round, I think what we're gonna do is do some pre-grafting in 1 gallon pots. And let them grow out for a year and then insert them, yes.
I'm sorry if you're doing questions at the end or now, but I got a question about the cider apples. Is it possible to just use native crab apples as
Yeah,
for cider purposes? Is that like something that anybody does?
yeah, it absolutely is. Actually, Eric himself, the Northwest Meadowscapes Farm. He does keep some of those just as the native crab apple. I have another gentleman in Snohomish County raising cane ranch that we went in and did an agroforestry planting last planting season and planted out quite a lot of Malus fusca. And he's just keeping them pure because he actually has an on-farm cidery. And he wants to infuse, he's got a lot of, cider apples, but he wants to infuse the native into that. And he made last year, he made Neronia berry cider, hard cider, that was.
Yeah, I was telling my brother about this, me and him make cider, and he thinks it's crazy. He's like, nobody does that. And it's just like,
Oh, yeah,
so now
yeah,
it's
there's
like, thanks for validating me here.
I think being close to Seattle and stuff, there's a real market for some of like the unusual, like native infusion into ciders and things like that. Like people really get into it and will pay to have some of that. So, yeah, people experimenting with it. Bow Hill blueberries, the last farm I'm going to talk about. Yes.
I was curious what funding sources you use, and specifically what funding source you use for the deer tax.
Yeah, so this was all through the specialty crop block grant. We put in just a big, good, robust budget for supplies. So that we can just, I will say that about agroforestry systems is a lot of farmers aren't used to them. This is the first time that they're putting trees back into their open farmland, and it's weird and it's a little uncomfortable and there's a lot of risk. Because these are perennials, right? They're gonna invest all this money and they're not gonna get anything out of it for 5, 10 years, depending. And so we're finding that if we can find the resources, the cost share to initially do the planting for them and get some of that infrastructure in place, that really reduces the financial risk. And we see a lot of a lot more willingness to adopt. And then I kind of said, we see it expand across the farm, after that. So after that first initial planting with assistance, then we do see farmers like biting the bullet and paying the cost to expand agroforestry systems a lot of times. So it's a great sort of upfront infusion to incentivize farmers to adopt. So yeah.
Yeah, proof of concept type of thing.
Yeah, it kind of proves it out to them, they get used to it, right? We also kind of help them through the management of the system for the first several years. Yeah, so it was all out of the specialty crop budget, yeah. Did you?
Not yet. Okay.
Not yet, okay. This was the last one we did, both the blueberries. They're a value add. Like they do run a weekend in the summer, but they mostly do value added products. And you see them in Hagen, and you see them in local markets and in farmers markets and all kinds of stuff. They make great blueberry products. Their focus are these old blueberry bushes that have been there for, I don't know, over 50 years or so. The problem here was that they have this surface water that runs right next to their blueberries. You can see that really evidently in that image there. And when we're getting this, these wet winters and springs, they get this flooding, these really high water tables. It's starting to impact their blueberries. There's just no buffer there between the berries and what's going on adjacent. And so at this site, we went in and we planted sort of this little buffer along that surface water. Next slide. They chose Rhodia berry, makes sense for their business. It's gonna feed into their value added business very, very readily. And then that was the crop they wanted, which makes sense. And then they chose to diversify their system with just these additional natives to bring in pollinators, to drink water, to give them this nice sort of native buffer with that crop infused into it. The challenges here were very minimal. Not a lot of deer browse. Not a lot of mold pressure. Plants did well. I think they had 100%, maybe they had one plant that didn't make it. I mean, they had really good survivability. Things are going well at this site, that we didn't have to install fencing. Yeah. Next slide. Yes.
Just kind of a random one today, the Shiitake berry, or it's,
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's a 6-acre farm, so it's not huge, but yeah. So that's what we've done. The grant is a 3-year grant. That's really challenging when you're planting a perennial system. Because we had all kinds of ambitions from like, we're gonna collect all this data. What we got was baseline data, right? We did collect soil data over the 3 years. We certainly documented what we planted, survivability, all of those things. But it would be great to see impacts on soils, on adjacent waterways, on things like that, as these systems mature. And with a 3-year grant, we can't do that. But we do at least have this good baseline data. So we certainly will be pursuing a second round of funding to continue to work with our existing farmers. And there are a lot of other landowners who have reached out to myself, to colleagues at Woodby and Skagit, that are interested in adopting these types of practices on similar types of land that they might have. So certainly another round of funding, we could incorporate some additional farms potentially, which would be great. As far as wrapping up the funding that we currently have, we will be producing a video. We're working with a videographer who's been sort of documenting the processes, interviewing our farmers. So that will be coming out in before September, probably in late August. We are creating a guide that has sort of why you would do this, why resources for farmers, market resources, so that, you know, these crops that farmers might not be used to, they have access to all kinds of market resources that they can connect with, resources for technical assistance, and then sort of a little guide for, you know, if I'm a farmer and I want to just give this a shot on some corner of my property on my own, we kind of have this little guide that can walk them through connecting them to nurseries and give them sort of a cost estimate of those kinds of things. So that will also be wrapping up in probably August, and we just send that out, and I think putting it on better ground potentially. So that's kind of what's coming as far as the end of this work. Next slide, please. So to kind of sum all this work up, so the climate's changing in our region, and producers are certainly feeling it, and they're expressing it, and they're trying to figure out how to adapt, not just to climate, but to regulation, to social pressures, all kinds of things, right? Development pressures. And agroforestry really is a great tool for that. It's a tool for mitigation. Governments like it, policymakers like it, funders like it. It's a tool for landowners to adapt. So once they can engage with it, get used to it, a lot of them grow to like it. Wet heat farming is an example of an attempt to design to adapt to very specific conditions in the Pacific Northwest. This isn't a magic, thing. There are challenges that we have to address, we have to adapt to, we have to make changes to these systems, but we're learning a lot from these systems. And then what other conditions can agroforestry help address? So while we're specifically looking at sort of wet, watery conditions, in this case, there are agroforestry systems for dry land. There are agroforestry systems that can help adapt to drought. There are all types of systems that we can design through agroforestry to adapt all kinds of challenges that we face. I would love to find out what other ones we can address. That's me. That's my contact info. If you've got questions or landowners or anything, want to collaborate on some of this fun stuff, you can reach out to me there. Next slide, please. I would encourage folks to sign up for our agroforestry newsletter as well. So we put this out once a quarter. And we highlight a farm that is practicing agroforestry in our region. And then we have some fun stuff like recipes and practice highlights. And it's just a cool way to kind of stay plugged in with how agroforestry is being practiced in our state and how it's kind of progressing and who the landowners are and all of that kind of thing. Next slide, please. I would encourage you to check out Agroforestry Northwest too, if you have more interest in agroforestry. We run a work group meeting every other month. We are going to start adapting the way we run that work group, but another way to engage on agroforestry in our state. Agroforestry Northwest is a nonprofit that has a regional scope of Washington, Oregon, and we're moving into Idaho. So thinking more broadly about the region and engaging with professionals and landowners who are sort of operating the agroforestry space, sharing knowledge, sharing opportunities, and that kind of thing. This is a great place to connect there. Next slide. And there are upcoming opportunities with Agroforestry Northwest. We are right now writing an actual guide for the Pacific Northwest for agroforestry. So if you go home today and you're like, agroforestry sounds interesting, I'm going to Google it. You're going to find a lot of great information from the Midwest, the Southeast, but you're going to find very little documentation from our region, the Pacific Northwest. We're behind the times with agroforestry adoption in this part of the country. And so this group right now is actively writing an actual guide for what agroforestry in our ecoregion looks like, because we look very different than the Midwest. And the applications of agroforestry in our region look very different than they do in the Midwest. So those resources can inform you and give you the basics, but this is going to get you into the nitty-gritty. And then we are going to start to offer mentorship opportunities. We are specifically interested in working with seaweeds as well. So reach out for engagement with this group. Oh, that is leftover stuff. So ignore that. Yes.
I have a few thoughts for you, just based on, what I've seen with experience. Beavers, like I suspect, at least the Bow Hill, maybe meadows, of course, but the meadowscapes may have problems with beavers. When you plant it, they will come.
Yep.
And but it's also a challenge in lowland areas, like that's the one thing you need on your little slide, is a little happy beaver that has caused a drainage problem. Yes. They're coming, if they're not there.
Yeah.
And but, green canary grass is, I have a little low wet field that I cut hay, and it is all green canary grass. And green canary grass, as you know, is super duper, super aggressive in wet fields.
Yeah.
And it's very competitive to blueberry out there,
Yeah,
but also spirea. Like I have one little blueberry patch that I've cut down the Douglas spirea probably 6 or 7 times and it fell back. And it's like a lot of work and it's very hard to, I mean, it's native plant.
yeah,
Grows in low wet areas, it should be there, but it out competes the blueberries.
yeah,
As well as other native willows, native dogwoods. It's like. Your shots are awesome, because it's like winter, there's nothing there, you're planting, but I bet if we went out there today, the grass is like this and it's still too wet, maybe the low. So those are the things I can't help
Yeah.
but think of that are gonna be challenges.
well, it's no different than riparian restoration, right? I mean, these are the same kinds of things. A lot of these, like, we talk about Northwest Meadowscapes. And the surface water and the planting. That's an area where, I mean, yes, beavers are gonna be an issue in certain places. That's an area where he's already got dense hedgerows along a lot of that surface water. And he hasn't gotten a beaver yet. So, yes, when beavers arrive, another challenge, right, that we're gonna have to face and adapt to.
There's all those things that someone's gonna.
Yeah, yeah.
Get the plans.
Yeah. The fun of working in nature-based systems, right? I had an ecologist say once, and I thought it was hilarious. He was like, working with nature-based systems, working in ecology, it's like, it's not rocket science. It's way harder. I was like, oh my God, yes. Yeah,
I really wish, I'm a part of repair and restoration. In fact, I was gonna stick to the purple mostly today, and, this seemed more up my alley, and I wish the rest of my crew was here. But anyway, besides that though, I'm curious because I know Washington has a lot of, like, former timberland, like I'm looking at buying some property, and there's a lot of places that used to be timberland, and there's a lot of places that like, where I guess it's kind of degraded, where it's like a secondary tree planting where you don't have much understory and the trees are really dense, you get like a dead zone. Is there like, can this be applied to a certain, like, say, like what I just described, and to where you can plant like understory plants and all that stuff?
Oh, no, sorry. One more. There we go. Forest farming trials.
Okay,
Agroforestry Northwest, just in collaboration with WSU Extension, just got grant money. We will be starting forest farming trials in the fall.
Wow.
And that's exactly the kind of thing, right? So the idea being that we work with a great forester, if he's a great speed forester, or if the landowner already has DNR or whoever. And they come in and do a great forest health plan first, right? And then maybe some of those practices get applied, those recommendations get applied. And then we start to explore the cultivation of certain things within that forest. In forest farming, cultivation does not have to be some non-native, food crop. It can certainly be native, right? It's just different than going out and foraging and finding a patch of whatever. Oregon grape, for example, let's say. Oregon grape is something that's got great market potential. It already has established research on its health benefits. It's got a great medicinal market already built up. Oregon grape is one that, companies like Herb Farm and Rose Mountain Herbs buy. So that would be instead of randomly.
Nice,
sorting,
huckleberries would go good too.
Yep, huckleberries, you would actually cultivate, create the conditions for that with, and maintain those conditions within your forest ecosystem. So that's the kind of thing we would apply to what you described.
Yeah, outside what I'm paid to do with the conservation district, that's something I really want to do, my own personal property, something that never happened, so.
Yeah.
Very, very good work you're doing.
Reach out and we
Yeah.
can talk about forest learning.
Yeah, I volunteer for the trials, like I'll volunteer my property for that, like as soon as I have such a thing.
Yeah. So maybe next way, I'll come and talk about forest learning and what we're doing with that. Any other questions? I don't, am I like, do we have a ton more time? You do, but, okay. What do I have? Oh, yes. Do you? Yeah. Yes, there is a movement right now being led by EcoTrust, not Agroforestry Northwest, but we're collaborating with them a bit. They are documenting indigenous agroforestry practices. They are talking with certain tribes on reinvigorating and getting the resources to re-engage with certain agroforestry practices that they may want to re-engage with. So that's a big movement right now. We have some tribal partners that we're working on securing funding to do native food forest plots with certain tribes. I know Basin CD is working with, say it again? Watson Island Tribe with some cool agroforestry type things. There are CDs doing some of that. I was just out with, several different tribes on Whidbey Island talking about, oak and camas restoration so that they can come and do their camas bakes. So yes, absolutely, really trying to be, because that's where a lot of our, what we do today is a modern version of a lot of what's rooted in their practices.
Was there gonna be a mushroom component?
There was not, so that was my colleague, and he was not able to attend. I'm so sorry. Yeah,
Serious.
but he is, I will say, since I'm not gonna talk about it, it's a WSU extension. And they're doing, do you know the name of the site? Myers Point. Yeah. He's doing log grown, forest understory log grown mushroom tribes there. And he's got a great webinar that you can access. He's got a lot of great information on his website, Patrick Schultz.
Oh, it's bad, okay.
Yeah, it's Patrick. So I didn't get to talk about it. He didn't get to come. But if you were hoping for mushrooms, that's where you can go find mushroom information. Sorry about that. Yes.
Actually, so is this what it is, website to contact you?
Yeah, and access all that stuff. Yeah.
It's with, I'm in Piercy and with our program, but I can hear about how to program for the whole system. And supposedly you can use that brain with the cider use to do your own mushrooms. So that's actually why I came here to see what is knowledgeable around there, so that way I can start contacting people, but I was just that contact to see. Maybe you're working with local cider use, one in a while, and that has taken a while to not. With the organization, great. So now our goal is to take that and repurpose it for other businesses.
That's a cool idea. Yeah, I know Patrick has mostly worked on log grown.
Yeah.
And he's got like different species he's trialed and things like that. I don't think he's done like spike brain, but he could probably point you to someone.
Yeah, I'm figuring,
You
you
know.
know, the guy that's good.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. A good place to start.
Yeah.
For the landowners who want to. Did they come in?
They, one of the landowners already had in mind, that was Northwest Meadowscapes, because he was kind of already going down that road. But the other ones did not, and so they, yeah, this was new to them. Yep. Yeah,
Were any of the uses what they're working at? And so what we're at.
yeah, so the first one I talked about, they are in transition, so they bought that old dairy land. Probably about three or 4 years ago. And so they're absolutely, you know, working towards that organic certification, so they've got that 3 to 5 year period, something that they can't use anything. Honestly, most of the agroforestry systems that I've planted and worked with tend to be organic operators. They use integrated pest management. They use, you know, organic certified techniques and applications. There are some things that organic producers can use to apply for certain pests and things like that. A lot of them will diversify their plantings with like insectivorous species that draw in like predator insects. So yeah, but the only one that I think is not organic is Northwest Meadowscapes. And he uses all manner of herbicides because, to your point, when you're trying to get native species and things growing in old forage systems like reed canary grass or some even some of the other forage grasses that aren't as horrible as reed canary grass, but they all can be pretty tough. Herbicides can be a great tool. So I've only, as far as reed canary grass goes, only worked with a couple landowners that have reed canary grass. And I think maybe the difference there between like planting restoration into reed canary grass and planting an agroforestry system into reed canary grass that's on farmland is that farmer is there messing around with that system all the time, right? Like they would any other farming system. They're managing it, they're present constantly. So there's a little more ability to battle with some of that stuff. But labor is always a consideration and it's always a balance. But yeah, most of them have been organic.
Yeah, what we're factored on site again.
Okay.
These take a lot of information labor, kind of check the government side.
Yeah. Some people are trying to reed canary grass is just the worst.
So
I mean, some people are trying solarization, some people are applying some herbicides if they're not organic. Some people are just out. At one site, we did have a section where we had some really ambitious labor, and we went out on planting day, and they actually stripped out manually all the reed canary grass, and then they planted. And it looked beautiful in the middle of winter. And then spring hit and the finch weed and the thistle, which was way worse than the reed canary grass, came up. So we were like, oh, that was not great. So yeah.
Wouldn't it also be more likely in that case that you're gonna get more rodent? If you pull all of the.
I mean, yes, luckily we were on just like a flat land, so that wasn't necessarily a consideration, but yeah, it was. Did you?
Yeah, I was curious if you could talk a little bit about the off-farm type of things that comes in that make it hard for support, like suppliers or food and hops or
Mhm.
wholesalers or their market stuff or nursery suppliers or what.
Yeah, nursery suppliers is huge. I spend a lot of my planting season engaging with as many nurseries as I can find because we have great nurseries set up to feed into sort of like our repair and restoration industry, but agroforestry being relatively new, it can be really hard to find a lot of agroforestry type plants at the scale that some of these landowners are planting at. So yes, that is a challenge that we need to address around agroforestry if it's going to grow and expand in this region, and landowners are really engaged and are really wanting it. So we're going to need good nursery resources. Market development, buyer development, again, is something that hasn't been done well in our region. Agroforestry has really been developing in this region for the last decade. And that's not to say it hasn't been practiced here. It's been practiced and dabbled in various ways, but as far as really growing into a state of a land use, like a dominant land use that we would see, is just the last decade. And so we actually are on the precipice of getting a great grant to work with Rodale Institute to come in. So Rodale Institute, if any of you are familiar with who they are, they're a big organic research nonprofit in the Midwest that has done, they were like the impetus of like organic certification and that kind of thing. So they have recently acquired a farm in Skagit County, and they now have a Pacific Northwest hub, Rodale Institute, and they are going to do a big market analysis and marketing campaign around agroforestry products for our region. So that's, all of this stuff is not here today, but it is in development. So they are going to research who the buyers are, research the crops, make the connections. They've got this 4 years of funding to just focus in on developing the markets. Look at the processing that needs to, look at the food hub connections, what exists, what needs to be brought in, all of that. Yeah, does that address? Okay. But nursery development? Yeah, I know you're a nursery guy. Do you want to grow some? I mean, you're native.
I grow.
Yeah, I mean, and we do.
Every now and then, well. Oh, yeah, I might as well just be an agriculture nursery.
Yeah.
Like, it seems like it could be so specialized and not people out there.
Well, and
Another third time thing, and another third time thing.
Yeah. well, and just at the point,
I was just gonna say, I work with tons of people that buy a squishy cushy property and they're like,
yeah,
I want to plant an apple orchard. And I'm like, well,
yeah,
you're probably not gonna be able on this 10 acres because look, we're squishing these around in you. You're not there to survive,
so, and we're just getting to the place where we're like, here are some of the real like dominant crops in these agroforestry systems in our region. And here's what we really need to be buying at scale, right? Aronia being one. The Malaspuska grafting thing, that is something a lot of people are interested in. And the other one is black hawthorn. Grafting pear and quince to black hawthorn, which is another species that can thrive in these conditions. So hazelnuts, another one. So we're now like, here's the crops that we can actually ask nurseries to grow at scale. Because in the years previously, it was kind of like, well, do we want to plant some of this, or will that be the one, and now we're kind of keying in. So I feel like we're just at the point where we can be like, hey, nurseries, here's what we really love to have at scale. Yeah, I didn't see that.
Smart sheets. That's good. Okay. The one I wrote down, I don't.
I know.
Or it might be like a project.
So how long have you been out? Oh, you're really, okay.
I mean, that's true, you know. I. Well, I look at exactly what you said.
So. I have this forest farm trip. What's, and I talked to you about that, I think the problem is. The owners are like that, right? You know, when we get money to do trials, landowners are like. And, you know, we almost might have to go for some vetting system, although we do want to be, especially in the agriculture, West, we want to be, right? So we want to be up and up, we want to be down. By, you know, over the view, we want to be over on the side, so we're really excited to engage. So we should talk, if you have. Sorry, yeah.
Sorry. Good. It's been a really long question. With the communication, leadership. Yeah. Yeah. And, yeah, just about how people, different personalities have, communicate differently. And how to effectively interact with each other. Yeah. I'm gonna put on the recording, so I can, yeah. It's pretty Hello, sir.
Hello,
Okay, is it?
Yeah.
not too bad.
But today,
Yep, that's one of the.
last one for today?
Yep.
Yay. Do you help me lead it? Okay. No?
Not driving there. 20 acre one, it says it was human caused.
Wait, another one?
Yeah, and they, where,
So there's Peony Creek,
yeah,
there's one by Mount Ann, but that might be